This story began in the church where the wedding ceremony took place. The beautiful blonde girl looked at her husband without taking her eyes off him. She was the happiest person in the world, because she really had to tie the knot with him now. It was one of the most magnificent weddings in London society, and the Admiral's eldest son, Naval Officer Edward Morton, took part in it, and also the only daughter of Viscount Dyer, who actively spoke in Parliament. Her name was Elizabeth. Everyone envied their union. After all, they were a truly ideal couple. After the wedding was over, Elizabeth decided to meet with her friend, who helped her find a groom. The woman said that the ceremony was simply beautiful, and they both looked like angels, but for her, the most important thing was the love with which they looked at each other. The woman knew her when she was a very little girl, and watching her create her happy family, she was touched to the depths of her soul. After this beautiful ceremony, they were supposed to go on a honeymoon straight to Italy. After the wedding ceremony ended with this matchmaker, Miss Laura, she met her second daughter, who was Jenny, because now she also needed to look for a groom. The girls really didn't want this. She was the younger sister of a school friend. Rosemary loved cricket and horse riding. Books were the most important thing in the world for her. However, now she was faced with a very serious problem. A man whom she considered just a friend wrote to her, informing her of an imminent marriage proposal. Therefore, he was going to come to them soon with an official proposal. The girl really considered him a kind and sensitive man, but did not want to marry him. She couldn't even imagine that he could have any feelings for her at all. All this time, she considered their relationship platonic. In fact, the second son of a noble family of gentry who had made their fortune independently in trade was very famous. They owned lands and estates, had an excellent reputation, were tall and had an attractive appearance. All these were characteristics of William Fergus, who was just about to propose to Jenny. Laura, being excellent with vodka, considered this man the ideal groom. Any unmarried girl of marriageable age in London would not have considered it an honor for him to propose. But some girls, for certain reasons, felt pressure at the thought of marriage, and that girl was Jenny. She seriously considered simply refusing the offer. However, she had special reasons for doing so. Her mother and uncle opened Mr. Firecracker's letter and were already discussing the wedding date, and she knew that she couldn't refuse him because they would be furious. But she didn't need this wedding at all. She knew that she would never find a better groom. However, she did not want to get married just because she was forced to. Laura then explained to her that living as an unmarried woman in their times was very difficult in various parts of life, but the most important thing was her own feelings. Therefore, she suggested that the girl put everything else aside and focus on her sister's emotions only, so she could understand whether she was ready to spend her whole life with this man. But it was quite obvious that the answer was negative. She didn't have time to say anything when a young guy suddenly approached them. This was supposed to be her future fiancé. Olga greeted them, and seeing how Jenny looked, asked if everything was okay with her, because the girl was somehow too pale. She said that she was fine, and that he didn't have to worry. To break the awkward atmosphere, Laura also intervened in their conversation and had a rather nice conversation with this young man. However, the man asked her for a favor. He asked, "Remember my peer with whom we recently became related?" Of course the girl remembered. He was quite a famous guy, talking about John Dalton of Whitefield. They grew up together and studied together. Recently, he wrote him a letter and said that he would come to London in a few months, but immediately after this letter, another one came from his daughter-in-law, Mrs. Ferks. The letter stated that she wanted the boy to introduce John to a worthy lady during his stay in London, so he decided that Laura could help with this. Of course, the girl took on this job. She soon wrote a letter to John. The guy was a tall, dark-haired man who had a very handsome and unforgettable appearance. But even so, he didn't understand what people found in him that made them want to do business with him. In fact, this guy was the heir to a large land estate, who in just a few years had more than quadrupled the inheritance he received from his father. He was not only young and handsome, but also very promising. So the girl now had to become friends with him in order to soon find a good partner. She, of course, doubted that the guy wanted her to introduce him to someone, but the man explained that in most cases it was his daughter-in-law's initiative, but he was still very grateful that the girl took on this matter. He knew that introducing him to some strangers would be very difficult, so he suggested that the thief first remain just a friend with him, and only then find a partner. The girl didn't know if it was the right decision. However, since Mr. Fairfax had tried so hard for him, she believed that he was a worthy person, so there shouldn't have been any problems. She put her worries aside because at the moment, Miss Hyde's affairs were very important to her, namely, her decision about the engagement. After the wedding was over, the girl returned to her estate and went up to her incredibly ill grandmother to visit her and bring her medicine. The woman was in a very serious condition, but she was still incredibly happy to see her granddaughter Laura, and tried to look as if she wasn't tired. I told her about how the wedding happened, and about the latest news, and they began to share pleasant memories of how this couple met and what happened with him. A lot of time had passed since they started talking because, in good company, time flew by incredibly quickly. But then my grandmother asked her to answer her honestly. She said, "I have never met a girl so beautiful, both externally and internally, but for some reason you use everything you have only for the sake of others." Laura's grandmother didn't understand why she didn't look for love, and she even thought to herself that it was only because she had her heart broken once, and because of that, she no longer wanted to look for love. Of course, the girl felt awkward talking about this, so she simply changed the subject, left soon after, and wished her grandmother good night. Her faithful friend Rosemary soon wrote the woman a letter in which she told her about the unpleasant news that had occurred. Jane was proposed to, but she refused it, and because of this, she now had serious problems with her family. Laura was a kind soul, so she decided to visit them and check. She asked Rosemary how everything had happened and asked her to come visit her. Elizabeth, who was Jane's older sister, said that it was better not to disturb her that day because she had already been on edge since the morning. Laura herself heard very loud screams from her room. However, she said that she was very sorry that she had to experience this, so she decided to immediately go to Elizabeth to check on her. And only after that she would go to her mother. In fact, everyone considered Laura an old maid who couldn't find a groom, and that's what they called the best mother-in-law in London. But the girl had long ago come to terms with this title, so she didn't even take offense when they said it to her face. When she came to Jenny, she saw an incredibly upset and sickly-looking tired young girl. Laura brought some delicious raspberry cookies with her, so she suggested we try them together. She tried to explain that one should not tempt one's body, even if her soul hurts. She began to console her that her action was correct, even if she doesn't feel right now, and said many other similar words. But Jenny suddenly interrupted her and said in a quiet voice, turning to Laurie, "Do you imagine your future when I—" The girl, of course, imagined all this perfectly. She would never have received any inheritance. This was the condition for her recognition as a member of the Pendleton family, and she initially agreed to this. Jenny had the same situation after her father died. Their family began to become poor, and if they lose this house after the previous one, they will simply have to move out of town. And it was for this reason that the girl simply had to marry this rich man. Now she blamed herself and considered herself incredibly stupid and also selfish. The girl didn't see any other solution, because she didn't even finish school properly, and she was always getting into trouble, so happiness was definitely not to be expected for her. Jenny was mostly upset about her age, because at 25, the chances of marriage were rapidly diminishing, and for an unmarried girl who would not inherit a fortune, the greatest fear was poverty. Once you open your eyes, you can notice how everything that was familiar slowly begins to disappear. The society that seemed safe and reliable suddenly distances itself from you as if you were a leper. Everyone begins to be enveloped by the fear that, without considering despair, you will not be faithful companions throughout your lives, and no one knew better than Laura how excruciating this fear was. The woman experienced it firsthand. However, she also knew that there were many ways to cope with this pain, and therefore she was serious about helping Jenny cope with it all. Laura even said that the girl could go to work as a typist. One day she bought herself a typewriter, but realized that she was more suited to work as a home teacher. She hadn't used it for a long time, so she could easily give it to Jen so that the girl could start trying herself in different things and not despair. Despite the fact that Laura was indeed with the Vaka and brought people together, she did not see this couple because the girl did not love this young man. Accordingly, she had to find happiness directly for Jenny herself. She asked the girl how Laura's proposal had been, since she had detailed a plan of action with which the girl could live peacefully. Jane, after listening to her, finally agreed, because she trusted this girl, and since then, quite a lot has changed. Several months passed from that moment, and just as promised, John arrived at the estate alone. The city didn't impress him at all. Everything was the same, an overly noisy anthill. The guy didn't feel right. The brother received him and said that during this time the guy could calmly attend several events without getting upset and all that sort of thing, to which he had already received invitations in advance. But the guy, of course, didn't like it. He expressed his entire opinion about people and high society, and in return called him simply a cynical person. However, he said that he should still come to the Morton couple's ball because he had found a truly reliable ally for him who could help him in some way. Of course, when he spoke about this ally, he meant Laura, who was already getting ready for this ball and was incredibly excited. A man who had previously refused all social gatherings and parties just for the sake of this ball was supposed to come there and agreed to make an exception because of this rumor. Many even confirmed their presence there. After all, he really was an outstanding person, and Laura was very happy that at least with the help of such a case she could get to know him personally. The maid even suggested that she style her hair differently for this wonderful event, because she believed that perhaps this man could fall in love with her at first sight. Of course, Laura argued with her, but in the end they agreed that the girl would style her hair as always, since there was little time. She quickly put on her ball gown, which was a soft pink color, and perfectly emphasized her red hair. The maid complimented her. When she arrived at the event a few hours later, she noticed that there were indeed a lot of people, as she expected. She hoped that Fairfax and Dalton had already arrived. At that moment, a Fairfax approached her and greeted her. They discussed the latest news, and Laura noticed that the wounds that Jenny had left on his soul were already slowly beginning to heal. The girl immediately got down to business and asked where John Dalton was. The guy explained that he was a little late because he was still meeting with his friends from university. However, very soon he was supposed to arrive at this event, and indeed, after some time, the guy was the first to notice his brother. The guy was already starting to worry that John wouldn't come to this event at all. However, as always, he started to be a bore and told his brother in every detail how terrible this event was. After this, the brother suggested that John follow him, and then he would introduce him to the lady. The guy immediately realized that his so-called ally was some lady, and because of this, he was not at all delighted. By the time they got there, the man had completely understood what he meant and realized that they were now trying to set him up with someone. He continued to be indignant and grumble, and because of this, the mood at Fairfax had deteriorated a little. But John even doubted that this woman would be smart, because there were many educated women in the world. However, he had never met truly smart and witty ones among them in his life. He didn't like it at all, so he suggested simply ending the conversation and simply asked him to meet his close friend. And when they came to the far part of the room, they saw Laura. He introduced his brother, John Downton, and the girl to the man. From the conversation, Laura came to the conclusion that he had come simply to meet friends, but he was interested in matters of love. So she didn't even know to whom she should introduce him. Fairfax explained that despite the fact that he did not like social life, he was still very serious about love. Therefore, deep down, he dreamed of meeting true love. When Laura first saw him, she realized that he was the most handsome gentleman she had ever seen. She had clarified some points with the Fairfax in advance, so she had already managed to work out a small plan of action. When they greeted each other, the girl realized that many women dream of connecting their lives with him, and she would certainly not judge them for such desires. Laura complimented him and said that he was a wonderful uncle to his nephews and a great brother to his sister. But for some reason, the guy didn't think so. He was hardly ever a good brother and told her a completely uninteresting story from his past in which there was little joy. When the girl listened to him, she concluded that he was definitely not like other gentlemen. There was something noble and refined about him that could rarely be found in the modern world. She also realized that he had a difficult character, and before introducing him to anyone, something had to be done about his stubborn behavior, so Laura was going to do that first. During the conversation, she gave him several compliments and said that he underestimated himself, because usually brothers like him are called very, very good. When Fairfax saw the change in his brother's expression, he was amazed and realized that the girl had somehow really managed to get through to him a little. But John himself was amazed. He wanted, as usual, to create a slightly awkward atmosphere and then leave under the guise of politeness. However, his opponent turned out to be not as simple as he had assumed. He was now interested in getting to know this girl better and understanding why she was exactly like that. So when they began to enter the event itself, the man asked how Laura was going to demonstrate her friendship. The girl explained that everything would be quite simple if he didn't come, and she would become his interlocutor and get to know her reliable friends. Well, if he goes far away, she will write him letters so that he feels her presence, even if it is a little one color. This is exactly how she was going to show her friendship. However, she asked only one thing from him, that he would always be honest with her. At that moment, the man even gave her a compliment. He said that these were the most wonderful things that could be obtained from friendship, so he expected a lot from their future communication. Then he swore on his honor as a gentleman to be honest with her as she wanted, after which he took and gently kissed her wrist. And the first thing that Laura suggested doing was getting to know her friends. She suggested that he invite one of them to a new dance that was supposed to start any minute. But in the end, it turned out that John did not know how to dance at all, and had never even learned. The girl, meanwhile, was trying to figure out how to get out of this situation. Since it would have been impolite to simply greet him without inviting him to dance, she asked if Mr. Dalton had good athletic skills. Fairfax said that he could certainly master any sport after just one demonstration, and then Laura decided that she could teach him dance very quickly, and then he would meet friends. The girl pulled him straight to the center of the dance floor and told him not to worry. She really was a good dancer and could teach him everything. And when John began to worry that he would step on her feet, she told him to just follow her feet and her, and then everything would work out for him. When the music started playing, they began to perform their movements. The girl noticed that she had very good coordination. His movements gradually began to improve. During the dance itself, she gave him some advice. However, it was still not perfect, so they had to continue. They were quite close to each other, and because of this, John was a little worried. However, she advised him to just look into the eyes and dance, then everything would definitely work out for him. After some time, his movements became more natural, and she even praised him. However, she still did not understand why, with such a talent for remembering dances, he still had not learned this business. However, the reason was very simple. He told her about what he didn't like about the learning process itself, and then Laura understood everything. He also doubted that he could even be called a gentleman, but Laura had her own opinion on this matter. She believed that if a man knew how to be respectful to any other person, then he could safely be called that. But John began to argue with her here too. The girl was conducting the conversation with him completely calmly. She was not even irritated by the fact that he found many excuses for every word she said. The girl said that the way he felt was quite natural, because even after spending many years in Swedish society, she periodically felt out of place, so he didn't have to worry about it at all. As they continued dancing, their conversation turned to the topic of love, and the man then learned that Laura believed in the existence of soulmates. He considered it just an abstract concept. However, the girl had a rather romantic attitude towards marriage and hinted that she had heard that he also had the same idea. But Laura eventually told him that she truly believed in soulmates and thought that marrying without love was absolutely pointless, and that was why she was a matchmaker. But for her, all this was very surprising. They had known each other for less than an hour, and she already had such warm feelings towards the man. Laura realized that he was truly a wonderful man who took the lady's words seriously, and this was a great rarity in their time. It was she came to the conclusion that he could be easily introduced to other ladies, and they could become quite good friends. Laura had such a premonition. After the dance finally ended, the girl said that he could now calmly dance with other ladies, so she wanted to introduce them. To begin with, I decided to go up to them and greet them, while the brothers were left alone and decided to discuss everything that had just happened. In the end, he got along well with the ladies she introduced to him. The situation softened, and the girl was truly pleased with this. Laura also noticed that Miss Lance looked very wonderful that evening, so she thought that perhaps they could get to know each other a little better and get along. Dora Lance was the only daughter of the Baron family, a combination of the flower of high society. That's what everyone called her. And Laura, watching this couple from the side, thought that they were simply made for each other. So she was glad that even when the other ladies parted, the two of them remained talking about something. Meanwhile, the girl was already getting ready to leave, since she had managed to complete her task for the day. The man offered to give her a ride. However, she refused and wanted to go home herself. Laura was curious whether Dalton had asked Miss Lance to dance. She thought it was likely, since the girl was clearly interested in him and showed it openly. But as soon as the girl got into the carriage, she began to think about the fact that if they both got married, they would become the most beautiful couple in all of London, and she would be proud that she was able to introduce them. Meanwhile, she was already getting ready to leave. However, the carriage did not go because the doors to the carriage opened, and there she saw Mr. Dalton, who was clearly sweating from running towards her. She immediately became scared and thought that something had happened, because he was supposed to be dancing with other ladies now, so she didn't understand why he ran to her. John said that she turned out to be very polite because he turned away for only a moment, and she already left without even saying goodbye to him. The guy was very offended by this, because she was his partner for the first dance. She could have at least said goodbye before leaving. The girl, with a smile on her face, asked him for forgiveness and said that she did not mean to be so rude to him. She thought that they would see each other again soon, so she didn't think about saying goodbye. She explained that they were supposed to meet soon because they often had such friendly tea parties and small musical concerts. It was a place where everyone could enjoy communication without unnecessary obligations, and she planned to invite a man along with Mr. Fairfax, and that is precisely why it was believed that they would soon meet. Clara explained that her grandmother was officially arranging these meetings. However, she was handling all the organization since she was too ill for this. The man, hearing this, became a little sad. However, he said that in that case, he would definitely come soon. She already wanted to say that she would send him the address and time. However, the man was planning to arrive until tomorrow. Laura was able to postpone this meeting for at least one more day, but she did not understand why he decided to rush in such a hurry. At parting, he kissed her hand and wished her good night, after which Laura left. However, throughout the entire journey, she was confused. They met only once, but he was so attentive to her that she realized that he was even kinder and more polite than she had imagined. When the carriage left, John felt something strange in the middle of his chest. His heart began to beat faster, and he was already looking forward to their next meeting. Ultimately, the whole story of John's presence at the Morton couple's ball caused a real stir in high society. Everyone dreamed of inviting him to their events, and someone turned out to be the most agile in this matter. Namely, the family of Baron Lance, Dora's mother, became interested after hearing about John and that they got along well at the banquet. Her daughter told her absolutely everything, and in the end, they really did persistently invite him to dinner, and her mother approved of this choice. In fact, the Baron Talenza family was famous for its dinners in London, mainly due to the exquisite dishes prepared by the best chef, but also the opportunity to meet their beautiful daughter Dora, who was truly charming. However, they had another reason why everyone wanted to visit them. The reason for this was Baron Lance, who was known for his careful selection of guests. Dora's mother learned a lot of secret and unusual information about John, so she believed that he, as a man whose family would definitely not go broke, was a good candidate for a husband. But Dorogo still insisted on her own. No matter how much money and land her suitors had, she was not going to marry without real attraction. Besides, this was only their second meeting, so she did not understand why they even brought up this topic. Then her mother did a very thorough job and convinced Dory that John was very interested in the girl in a romantic sense. She didn't know if it was really so, although no one had ever told her that someone couldn't like her. And besides, he was especially kind to her, so Dora really believed these words. She even thought that he had already fallen in love with her and thought that it was too fast and expensive, and in the end, she was very naive. And that is why she took her mother's words so seriously and seriously believed them, although it was not true. And while she was indulging in her fantasies, many continued to closely follow absolutely every step of John. However, half a month had passed since that day, and all the social events he attended were organized directly by Miss Pendleton or were held in her company. These two have become quite close lately, and if someone from the outside had looked at how he looked at the girl, it would have immediately become clear to them why he attended all the events where she was. A lot of time had passed since the man appeared in society. However, it was extremely difficult to see him, so their meetings were short and not very frequent. Many of the inviters even began to lose patience, but deep down, they all felt relieved. People were a little afraid of this man. Rumors spread that because he was constantly near Laura, who appeared with Paha, everyone assumed that he had decided to find himself a bride. But this was all wrong. Mr. Dalton also did not know that she was playing the role of matchmaker, and during all the time that she spent with him, Laura realized that he was not at all interested in finding a wife. That's why she became incredibly interested in what he was doing then. The man always attends her tea parties and lunches and has never missed a single one, even despite his busy schedule. She introduced him to most of her circle, and he even found common topics for discussion with some of them. However, he never showed any particular interest in any of the ladies at such meetings. Even if he started a conversation with someone, he always returned to Laura's speeches or started an intricate conversation with her. At some point, the girls even began to think that he was more interested in their friendship than in a romantic relationship. Although she liked this kind of attention, after all, she had not had such close friends for a long time. Thanks to her close relationship with John, she learned a lot about his home and that his family owned a huge plot of land with fertile fields and bushy faces. Their estate is located on a hill in the center of the property. Listening to the man's stories, she imagined everything so clearly that it was as if she herself was transported to that place. Looking out the window, she could imagine a forest full of snow-capped birches, perfectly matching the name of their place, as well as fields where agricultural work was in full swing, as if unfolding right before her eyes. His voice, when he described his native places, sounded with sincere warmth and love. A smile even constantly appeared on his face when he spoke about his native home. One day, when they met for tea, their conversation turned to drawing skills, and Laura discovered the pleasant surprise that the man was a little interested in this activity. Usually boys are not given an art education, so she thought that since he knew how to do it and was really interested in such things, it was simply excellent. After this, he told her about his little sister and also his nephews, whom he loved with all his heart. During this conversation, Laura learned that they also had a little nephew who was named after John early on, and she really wanted to prepare a small gift for him because it was thought that it would be nice. The girl also came to the conclusion that Mr. gave something and is a more interesting person than she initially thought. He is the one who is not afraid to criticize even what was dear to him, but at the same time, he feels a sincere, soft affection for these things. He looks broadly at the whole world and directs his deep feelings only to a narrow circle of close people whom he trusted. So Laura came to the conclusion that this man was simply made for an ideal marriage, but she did not understand why he did not show any interest in women and love in general. She would like to take a more active part. However, she could not do anything when he himself decided to find a partner. She would pray that his companion would be the same as him so that they could create a simply amazing family. When several days had passed since that moment, Laura was already dressed in her beautiful clothes from the very morning and was getting ready to go somewhere. The maid was shocked because she didn't know that the girl would be leaving so early. If she had known, she would have definitely come to help. However, Laura did not blame her because Mr. Dalton had recently come and offered to take a walk since the weather was wonderful. The girl simply could not refuse and therefore got ready as quickly as possible. The man was already waiting for her in the living room. The maid was a little wary. She noticed that this man had begun to visit their estate quite often. She immediately became interested in hearing all the details about it. Then the maid suddenly handed the mistress a small hat that looked very beautiful, but Laura said that she would not wear it. After all, they were not going to a picnic, and this accessory would be too flashy. In the end, they agreed on another hat that was less provocative, but still fulfilled its function and protected the head from the scorching sun. The maid had several guesses about the reason for the man's frequent visits. She believed that the first was that he was enchanted by their family's dishes and wanted to lure them away as a cook. But the second one, which was more likely for her, was that he was in love with someone who could only be met in this house, and that is why he went to all the events. Laura, of course, did not understand that they were talking about her, but when the maid explained it to her, she replied that this definitely could not be, and suggested that the girl not make up nonsense. She had never seen a man look at her with some unusual look that would contain such feelings. So if this was really the case, she would have noticed everything a long time ago. They argued with each other for a while, but Laura wasn't going to listen to her position anymore. After all, she was already late for the meeting, and didn't want to keep the man waiting for a long time. The maid understood perfectly well that the girl spoke this way only because she did not see him looking at her with such a look when she did not notice it, this look filled with love and warmth. Of course, such a look is definitely not used on people who are absolutely indifferent in a love sense, so her maid was absolutely sure of this. This naive lady helped others arrange their personal lives. However, in the end, she didn't understand anything about her own, since she still hadn't noticed that look. After some time, they arrived in the city to take a short walk and began to make small talk about the weather lately. They also discussed the couple Mrs. and Mr. Morton, who are now married, and they noticed that the two of them have changed quite a lot for the better since their wedding. The guy even praised her for the fact that she, with her own efforts, was able to create such a wonderful union as theirs. It was truly wonderful. Because of this, Laura was very worried because she understood that she had now been exposed as a matchmaker, and she definitely did not want that. Well, the man reacted quite calmly to this. He called her actions even an achievement and praised her for doing her job so well. Laura was very embarrassed because of this. She said that she didn't think that it was so important. John couldn't take his eyes off her at that moment. She was, as always, simply delightful. However, when she was embarrassed, her cheeks turned pink, and he liked her even more at such moments. She always responded to sincere compliments with ordinary embarrassment. A gentleman would have changed the subject so as not to put the lady in such an awkward position. However, the man wanted to watch how the color flooded her sweet cheeks. It was not for nothing that he recently admitted that he was the last one to be called a gentleman. That is precisely why he was going to use such a title. And that evening, Laura confessed that, at the request of Firefax, she had to introduce him to one of her friends and arrange their future marriage. That's why she invited them so that he could meet as many people as possible. Even when she taught him to dance, it was so that he could dance with other ladies. Laura was even more worried about this because she had agreed to keep this information a secret, but ended up spilling the beans. However, when the girl looked at John and saw his calm expression, she immediately realized that he knew all this very well. He was very sorry that the girl had to lie. However, he was simply delighted with her infallibility. As a result, when they talked about this situation, no one held a grudge against each other. The man, on the contrary, was even glad that she wanted to help him. For him, it was pleasant. But Laura didn't even need to apologize, because the man wasn't thinking about marriage at all at home. He was trying to find a suitable companion, but it wasn't about high standards or searching for an incomparable beauty. He simply could not find a lady who would be willing to open her whole heart. The girl then realized that he was simply looking for the woman of his destiny. Even though it sounded quite loud, he just thought that somewhere in the world there was his person, and he believed that when he met this lady, it would happen naturally without any effort, and searching without the intention of finding someone special. Then the man realized that he still believed in the existence of fate, and perhaps even kindred spirits. But Laura did not mock him. She only suggested that he should be a little more active in seeking his destiny. Since he was already in London, she believed that this would definitely not make things worse. Well, the man still refused this. Laura thought that it was because he didn't like meetings organized by other people, but the man said with confidence in the voice that there was simply no longer a need for them. Of course, the girl did not immediately understand what this meant, but she did not even have time to ask him because Miss Lancy was passing by in a carriage, and seeing the woman, she decided to get out and say hello. The girl looked very beautiful. However, in most cases, she wanted to talk to John. When she found out that he would be staying in London for a long time, she informed him that the ball season would soon begin, and if he had time, she would like him to join her and his friends. The man didn't know if he would have time for all this and started throwing around excuses. However, when Alo said that if the girl was invited, she would go, he immediately agreed. Meanwhile, Laura noticed that Miss Lancy was acting a little differently than usual. She was always so proud and independent, but now she was talking persistently to the gentleman. She thought about the fact that something had happened between the two of them that she didn't know about. But after observing them a little longer, she realized that this relationship was only one-sided. The man was completely uninterested in this dialogue. In the end, the girl very soon returned to her carriage and left, and also told them that they should definitely attend these balls, because they were simply wonderful. But when the girl left and John began to speak well of Miss Lancy, Laura concluded that they had a normal relationship. So this made her happy. After this, their topic of conversation shifted to William and Miss Jenny. The girl was amazed at how good a relationship they were going to maintain with each other, even after this humiliating refusal to the man. Moreover, he insisted on his own that he wanted to help her write a recommendation and find a job. When John heard this, he agreed with the girl and said that for him, this was very unusual behavior. But Laura didn't have that opinion and said that thanks to this, she now had a good friend like him. So she asked him not to be so strict with William. They also agreed that they would organize a meeting of the three of them on a boat for a small picnic, and decided to invite William there too. He could help them very well. A few hours later, the girl returned to her house and invited the man to come in and have a cup of tea. He refused, but asked her to stay a little longer because he wanted to tell her something. And then, in a very serious voice, John looked Laurie straight in the eyes and asked William Fairfax if he ever courted you. The girl certainly didn't expect to hear such a question. She immediately told him the whole truth, and even said that she was surprised to hear such questions from him. She immediately became very embarrassed and felt awkward about this situation. But he was also pleased with her behavior because it meant that she was telling the truth, and that is exactly what he wanted to know. After this awkward conversation, they finally parted ways, and Laura just stood there for a while, looking into the distance, not understanding what had just happened. After their walk, Laura thought for quite a long time about the relationship between Mr. Dalton and Miss Lance. Unlike the proactive girl, Mr. Dalton's reaction was completely indifferent. She believed that perhaps this is how Lance behaves when he experiences true love, because such behavior was completely unnatural for the girl. In public, she hides her feelings, but when alone, she reveals them completely. And if this was really so, then Laura thought about the fact that perhaps the girl had misinterpreted the man's behavior because she had definitely expected some kind of reciprocity from him. In fact, Miss Lance was a wonderful lady with many virtues, but she lacked life experience and was too sensitive to praise. Flora assumed, and in the end turned out to be right. However, she did not know that someone wanted to see the girl with John together, and therefore this person decided to push her to get closer to him. Miss Lance was also a reasonable lady, so she believed that perhaps they really had feelings for each other, and Dalton's words about him no longer needing a matchmaker concerned precisely this girl. This made Laurie feel a bit uncomfortable, but in any case, she understood that from the position's point of view, it was simply an ideal union. Miss Lance, although small, still had a noble title, albeit without a significant dowry. Dalton didn't have a title, but he had an influential family and a huge fortune that he could increase even more. Well, Laura couldn't know for sure. These were just her guesses. As the person who introduced them, she now had to carefully watch the developments and hope for a happy ending. Several days have passed since then, and Laura decided to come to Miss Hyde to visit her matchmaker. She was a little late because she wanted to arrive earlier, but there were heavy crowds on the street because there was supposed to be a reception at Baron Bailey's. Laura was also supposed to go there, but due to her grandmother's deteriorating health, she decided to just stay and be close. And besides, she herself was more comfortable staying at home, reading and spending time alone, than going to various receptions where she didn't even know half the people. In fact, Miss Hyde came to practice her typing skills a little. She came to Laura quite often because she had a simply wonderful teacher. Despite her frustration and lack of self-confidence, Jenny was doing quite well for 2 months now, going to the library and training, so, during this time, she was really able to improve her skills well. When Jenny first came to this place, she was amazed by the number of books that Laura had, and when she saw the typewriter, her eyes sparkled even brighter. She also told her a short story about how she mastered the knowledge of a typewriter and even tried to get a job in an office, but it turned out that this work was completely not for her, so she quickly left there. But Laura still didn't regret anything, because in the end, she had acquired a very valuable and important skill, and now she could pass it on directly to Jenny, who could find it very useful. The girl was delighted from the very first press of the key, and after some time, she was able to advance very far and became much better at managing all of this. In fact, sometimes Jenny was even afraid of Laura during lessons. She would never have suspected that the girl could be so strict and responsible in any matter. Well, now she looked at her in a new way, and with admiration after the lesson was over, Jenny began to wonder what Laura was writing down from one book onto the parchment. The girl explained that she had studied Latin and had just copied some texts. And when Jenny looked at the other books, she was very amazed because they were in other languages, and Laura knew all of this. Jenny was so amazed that the girl was able to translate so much text with the help of one dictionary, and she couldn't even make out a letter, so she said that Laura was simply amazing. She even praised her and added that if the girl were a man or lived in some other time, she would be able to go straight to Oxford because they love smart people like her there. The girl was delighted by these compliments. She was truly pleased, and she also thought about becoming a governess and preparing other people for admission to this institution. Jenny was then even more amazed because while she was learning to type, her teacher was still preparing for her career as a governess. She always seemed very calm and reserved, but in the end, she turned out to be a real lady in every sense, and it was simply impossible not to admire her. No one could even imagine that behind such a pretty face lurked a man who was waging a fierce struggle for his future. Laura also explained to the girl that she always had to improve herself, because with her current knowledge, she would only be accepted into a family with daughters to become a governess. In any home, if financial difficulties arose, the first thing they would do was refuse to educate girls. So the education of girls was valued much less. And the job of a governess is unstable, unlike teaching boys. So she was able to think everything through in advance and decide what would be best for her. She was going to improve her knowledge and become a male governess. She was also going to extend this profession for quite a long time for herself. Well, if for some reason she had to leave her job, she was ready to try to get a job at a school. She would like to get a place at her alma mater and work there until retirement. Then she would like to buy a small house outside the city and lead a simply solitary life. Laura believed that if she tried really hard now, she would eventually be able to realize her plan. And that is why she worked so hard. Jenny admired her teacher because she had never even thought about her future in such a perspective. So she admired Laura. Then Laura saw an invitation to the Miss Lance picnic and suggested that Jenny go there together. After all, when she finds herself working, she simply won't have time for such entertainment. So now it was time to enjoy this vacation. But this picnic was a great opportunity to melt the glacier with former best friends. They weren't feuding, they just felt awkward being around each other. So she hoped that this picnic could make Jenny and William friends again, and that would in turn make it easier for Miss Hyde to find a job, so everyone would win. And while Miss Cattleton and Miss Hyde were waging their quiet, stubborn struggle, time moved forward inexorably. And finally, the day of the picnic, which was organized by Miss Lance, arrived. A lot of different guests gathered there. In particular, there were aristocrats who were glad to attend the event after a long time. They had to move to another very beautiful place. So many carriages were chosen to accompany them, and he was completely unhappy with the carriage he was put in. For some reason, he had to go directly with the girl and not where Miss Paddleton was. And John was also very upset to hear that the carriage in which Laura would be located would be driven by William. For some time, the men watched as the guy gave his hand to Laurie and looked at her. Because of this, he became very angry, but tried not to show it openly. But in any case, he decided not to be upset because the day was supposed to be long. So, he was going to take advantage of this wonderful opportunity. The man thought that since the circumstances had already developed this way, he could at least establish an acquaintance with her friends, so he approached the ladies and they all went to the right place. He was a coachman and accompanied the girls who sat behind and whispered and giggled all the time. One of Miss Lance's friends suddenly spoke to John and asked why he no longer attended dinner parties at their house. The man apologized for this, but explained that he had recently had a lot of things to do that he couldn't put off. So, it was just the circumstances. The girls discussed this situation for a long time on the road and basically discussed John. The man tried not to listen to them and concentrate on driving. And then suddenly, this conversation turned to Laura Peddleton. They were talking about how absolutely everyone in town knew that the girl didn't have a penny of dowry and believed that was why she couldn't find a worthy match for herself. With such an appearance, and coming from such a city, she could have long ago become a noble lady. But until now, not a single worthy man has proposed to her. Miss Paddleton herself understands that the reason is the absence of a devotee, according to the girls. However, for some reason, she could not fix this problem. They didn't understand why her family couldn't allocate any money for them. She already wanted to tell her one of the gossips, but didn't have time because Miss Lance interrupted her and even scolded her for saying something like that. But soon the carriage stopped, and he said that they had arrived at the picnic spot. They could calmly go down and explore the location. All the men came out and helped the girls down. And when everything was finally set up for the picnic, the hostess said that they could comfortably sit with those with whom they were riding in the same carriage. And those who wanted to go for a boat ride could go straight to the pier after the speech was over, and everyone went their separate ways. Even John, who stood next to her, was constantly looking in Laura's direction, and so it became obvious to the girl that he was thinking about the conversation of those aristocrats who were discussing her. Victoria, as always, said that this was unnecessary. Because of this, the girl was upset, because she hoped that this picnic would go just perfectly. But then, to her surprise, John suddenly suggested that she take a little walk together, just the two of them. She was a little embarrassed, but was delighted with this proposal. She thought about what she could even talk to him about, because she was still worried about how unexpectedly he decided to invite her on this walk himself. But to her surprise, the man started the conversation first and wanted to ask her a question. This concerned, of course, that conversation in the carriage. He was very sorry that he had to ask such a question, because asking her close friend about Laura's personal affairs was certainly very awkward and wrong. But he still valued his friendship with this girl as much as with Miss Lance, and therefore, thinking about their future communication, he believed that he should know the whole truth. When Miss Lance heard this, she immediately realized that he was really very worried about it, so she decided it would be best to tell him the truth. That evening, Joanna learned that Miss Fidolton's mother was the family's biological daughter, which is why she was the pearl of high society and had many different admirers. However, at the age of 17, she suddenly simply disappeared. No one knew the reason. She simply ran away at night with an American artist who had come to paint a portrait of her family. They never got married officially, but simply hid and began to live together. However, she died at the birth of Laura, and the artist left the child in the care of Lady Ebesil. And after that, he simply disappeared. Everyone decided that he abandoned his daughter and started a new life in order to avoid taking on such a big responsibility. But no one knew the truth, and Laura remained in that family. She was officially recognized as a member of the Pendleton, and it was for this reason that she did not have any devotee, and her parents could not provide her with one. Miss Lance felt a little sad. She understood that he was probably also shocked by this situation, but she herself was very upset that Laura had to go through something like this. Well, even though the girl told him this story, she of course made a lot of compliments towards the girl and told him how beautiful she was. The only reason she didn't have a devotee was because when she was adopted into the family, her uncle, Mr. Pendleton, was categorically against it. And in order to settle this issue, Lady Abigail agreed to transfer her inheritance to Mr. Pendleton's son, as a result of which Laura did not get a single penny. The girl asked the man not to look down on her, even though the blood of a commoner flowed through her veins. After all, that would be wrong. The man was genuinely amazed that she thought he could think that way. After all, it was just a trifle for him, and he behaved in this way only because he was a little surprised that she had such a difficult fate. But now at least it became clear to him why Laura was always lonely and tried to stay away from people. Miss Lenz didn't know him completely. However, she believed that he most likely just said that so that no one would think badly of him. But even if it was true, she became interested in what could have upset him so much. After some time, the nonsense returned to her friend, and they were supposed to go for a boat ride to have a good time. She did not even offer this to the man, because she understood that they had already spent a lot of time together. Meanwhile, John himself went for a walk around the area. The weather had already become quite warm, and he was surprised, since he had not planned to stay in London for so long. But for some reason, he was again wasting his precious time on the holiday and various fun, although he had a lot of urgent matters that were waiting for him at the estate. And yet, despite everything, he still remained there and waited for the right moment. After all, he had his own goals and thoughts about this. And the reason for all this was, of course, one thing: Laura. He realized that this girl had become truly very special for him and simply could not do anything about it. The last month turned out to be a series of unexpected events. Like a fool, he circled around the girl, trying to find at least the slightest opportunity to even just talk to her. Without any need, he talked about himself and his past, and for the first time in his life, the man understood what it meant to be enchanted by some person. He simply could not even control himself. For him, this was something new, but at the same time, it was also pleasant. But now, having been in this place a little longer, he realized that for some reason everyone was ignoring the lore. As expected, the high society of this city is filled with nothing but wives. It was enough to hear the girls' conversation in the carriage for it to become clear to him how rotten their society was. They had endless prejudices about other people's lives, and he was very tired of it because he did not know whether Laura's reserved and modest nature was not just a character trait, but a habit that had been developed after many years of neglect. She had been here completely alone for so long, and he didn't know if there was anyone who could become a support for her. Of course, he was pleased to dream that he could become this person. However, the man understood that the reality was different. If John had been allowed to be at least a little bit like that for her, if she had been able to trust him with her wounds and allow him to heal them, then he would have definitely been able to make her happy and become worthy. Then suddenly, passing near the lake, he heard familiar voices, and coming closer, he saw that it was Laura, William, and Jenny. They were near the lake and playing with stones. No one noticed him at first until the man, as always, made a remark towards William. Laura was very happy to see Mr. Dalton because she had not seen him during the entire event, so she even invited him to sit next to her and keep them company. They even made a few bets on who could throw the stones the farthest, so the relationship between Jenny and William began to gradually improve, and Laura was very happy. Soon even John was drawn into this game. Of course, he agreed only to please Laura, since she insisted on this more than anyone else. He had to compete against Jenya in order to restore William's honor, but the guy laughed and said that nothing could restore his long-lost honor. After the competition began, the man realized that it had been a long time since he last played, so he didn't know what had helped him succeed at all. But even his first strike was simply superb because Laura began counting the seconds that the stone flew, and it set a new record for the day. Jenny immediately became wary. She realized that she had underestimated her opponent, but she could not lose, so she adjusted the size of her hand and her throw. He turned out to be truly excellent and was even able to beat the man's throw and set another new record. William talked to Jenya for a while and asked her to teach him her technique. John decided to take advantage of this opportunity and suggested that the girl find another entertainment while the two were arguing among themselves. So they decided to take a little boat ride because the weather was just perfect, and Laura hadn't done that for a long time. They discussed what had happened to them during this time that they had not seen each other, and the man was incredibly pleased with her company. He was ready to listen to her voice for an eternity. One block they were in was quite small, and because of this, he was a little embarrassed. Their legs were practically touching each other, and the man always controlled himself so that this did not happen. After a short silence, Laura told him that her plan to bring William and Jane closer together, and she also had one guess about his marriage proposal. She believed that he then proposed to her out of friendly affection, and he was glad that the topic of conversation had gone into such a direction, so he asked the question that had been bothering him for some time. He wanted to know if the girl thought that spouses could be happy if their union was based on friendship. He meant those couples where the life partner was perceived as a close friend. The girl, of course, thought so, because there were a lot of such couples, but it was rather strange for me to hear this from the man, because he didn't understand how this could happen at all. Laura explained that love sometimes becomes the cause of quarrels, and that in order to live together for a long time, it is much more important to have mutual trust than ardent passion, which could even soon fade away. She shared her entire attitude towards marriage, and it was that marriage begins with love, but ends with friendship. After all, passionate love had its expiration date, and sometimes it could end quite quickly. And he said that she said wise words. However, he was not. He still completely agreed with them because he had his own opinion on this matter, which he shared with the girl. Laura replied with a smile on her face that she also believed in the power of love and was sure that the man would definitely be able to find exactly the kind of love he was thinking about. John was very panicked. On a normal day, he would have controlled himself with incredible ease. But on this day, for some reason, he was drawn to do something stupid. He wanted to touch her hand and kiss her and tell her about the feelings he was experiencing. However, the man understood that this could not be. He simply had no right to even think about such a thing. The man blushed quite deeply, and Laura, who always saw him as having control, panicked and thought that he might even have gotten sick. They spent the rest of the walk discussing neutral topics, and when they finally reached the shore, Laura thought that he was probably overtired, so she hoped that he was okay. But she still thought that it would be best for him to sit down and rest a little. The man was really very worried, even just being near her. And that was why his heart was beating faster and his face was red. The man knew that if he continued to sit next to her and look into her beautiful, charming eyes, he would no longer be able to maintain his composure. Therefore, in order for the man to at least be able to raise his head, he invited the girl to sit next to her, and they sat for some time on the big stone, observing the beautiful nature that surrounded them. They were silent for a while, but Laura decided to start a dialogue again and asked if his home was even a little bit like this. Smiling, he said that in general, they were indeed similar in some ways, but he told her about some of the differences and the virtues that made his home even more beautiful. He would have long ago wanted to leave London and said that many were probably envious of the girl because she lived in the Grosvenor area right in the center of London. The girl agreed with him and said that it had an abundance of goods and a sea of opportunities, but at the same time, it was very noisy and quickly tired her out, so she would prefer another place for a quiet life. The man also added that if this were his homeland, she would be able to enjoy such landscapes absolutely every day. He told her about all the advantages of life there and the girls. She really liked it and thought it would be simply amazing. But of course, she couldn't afford it. The man even proposed to her to visit his home, and the girl readily agreed, as she had wanted to visit there for a long time. But of course, she couldn't do it right now. She would have to wait until the mistress appeared in his house, because that was the only way to do it. The man could not believe that this was really necessary and was very upset because he hoped to see his girlfriend there as soon as possible. John was going to speed up the search for the mistress, and after that, he was going to take her word that Miss Pedalton could stay in his house for as long as she wished. For him, it was really important. The girl was a little surprised by this. However, she was not against it, because it was still his decision, so she could not climb out there. But she found it difficult to imagine a girl like that who wouldn't mind the constant presence of another lady in the house. The man did not agree with her because he believed that if he did marry, the mistress of his house would choose her too, and without this condition, his wedding would certainly never have taken place. Laura, hearing this, was amazed for a while. The man wanted to say something. However, she suddenly stood up and said in a detached voice that his wife would still be against it. Therefore, she would like him to make this invitation as a friend. After this, the girl could not stay there any longer and left. John was amazed. He realized that he had ruined everything, and because of this, he was incredibly angry with himself. He himself could not believe that he had just proposed to her, although he had not even thought about it. But he realized the fact that everything was just a waste. But the worst thing was that he did it right after the girl clearly made it clear that she saw him only as a comrade. John was upset. He had just been rejected, and quite rudely at that. Showing persistence by giving in to his feelings and emotions was rather stupid. He himself asked for this refusal, and this is what he got in the end. In fact, the man, while initially staying in London, was only thinking about proposing to her to get married, or at least to get engaged, and then returning together to his estate. But now, having made such a clumsy proposal, without even thinking up all the details, he understood that it deserved such a refusal. He intended to go to the girl as soon as possible and explain to her everything that had happened. If he said that his actions were not a momentary impulse, but a reflection of all the feelings that he really experiences, then he was sure that the girl would reconsider his words and might even be able to agree. But when he returned to everyone for the picnic and tried to find out where Laura had gone, he was told that she had urgent business, and so she left. Then the man finally realized that he had irrevocably ruined everything. He said that he would like to visit her as soon as possible. After all, they had one unfinished conversation, but Laura's friend did not make him happy. And all because before leaving, she said that due to family circumstances, her family would not be able to receive guests in the near future. Some relative was supposed to come to them, and therefore, they would be focused on this guest in the majority. The next day, of course, John went to the estate, but they didn't even let him in the door. They just politely asked him to leave so that they wouldn't have to use force. He even wanted to deliver the letter, but the maid refused, and he certainly foresaw such an outcome. Therefore, He decided to return to this place a little later when everything had calmed down, but he was not going to give up his attempts. Meanwhile, Laura watched him from her window. She felt sad about doing this. However, the girl simply had no other choice. And from that moment on, a whole week passed, and John was still unable to get to her estate. Little by little, the man even began to lose his mind. From the couple of years since he was thrown out the door, he still came to their estate day after day, but they couldn't even let him in the door. They chased him straight off the street. All that was left was to wander aimlessly around the neighborhood. He could not believe that now her heart was lost forever, and that what was between them could no longer be returned because of one small mistake. John tried to think of some way to fix all this, but he couldn't. Lately, he was very agitated and nervous, and couldn't even do his job properly. His brother William noticed that something was wrong, but he did not interfere in the situation. He only handed over a letter that turned out to be incredibly important for John, so he immediately got ready and went to Laura the next day. He asked that they make an exception and be sure to deliver the small package that he had prepared for her. The maid still didn't let it through. She said that if the man really needed it incredibly urgently, then he could send it by mail. Of course, the man would have done so if he had had time. However, the train was already leaving, so he simply had no choice. They argued among themselves for some time, and after this, the man decided to bribe her and gave her several bills so that she would just hand over the package to the girl. The woman took them, but soon changed her mind. She turned the money back to him and asked that instead he simply fulfill her request. She was ready to give his message, but she wanted him to promise that he would definitely return to London and try again to win her love. John certainly didn't expect to hear this. The maid advised him to go home and prepare to win her heart again. She believed that he would succeed. He just needed to use his imagination. After the man had already left, the maid went up to Laura's office and handed her a package from Mr. Dalton. Of course, the girl was angry at the maid for taking this package. After all, they agreed that there would be no news from him. But Anna explained this whole situation and the urgency, so she quickly opened it and saw that there was originally a letter there. She decided to read it first. John said that he had to leave London suddenly, and in order to clarify his situation, he had to inform her of the sad news. Their pastor, Mr. Genfield, had died, and therefore he had to return to his homeland to honor his memory, and also, as a landowner, to appoint a new pastor. As soon as the matter was settled, he would deliberately, immediately return back to Long. Moreover, until their abruptly interrupted relationship was restored, he would not be able to leave the city. So she could not even hope. He noticed that after that picnic, the girl began to avoid him. But he did not feel any resentment towards her and only hoped that their friendship would return. He really believed that after he settled everything and returned to London, the girl would be able to give him a chance to explain everything to her. Also in this package, there was a small frame with a picture inserted in it that John had painted himself. It was simply magnificent. It was his estate and the beautiful view that was nearby. When Laura saw this masterpiece, her eyes simply shone with happiness. Meanwhile, the maid began to think about the fact that the man would clearly succeed in winning her forgiveness and perhaps even establishing a close relationship with her, since he was even trying to be there for her. The maid also became very interested in what was written in the letter that was attached to the painting and what actually happened between the two of them. On Laura's orders, they hung this painting in the middle of the estate, and that evening the girl reread this letter, precious to her heart, more than once. The maid thought that this letter could contain a declaration of love or a marriage proposal, in which case she did not understand why Laura had such a gloomy expression on her face because of this. She was simply burning with curiosity and did not understand why Miss was as intractable as other ladies. It was impossible to get anything out of her. But then suddenly, after a short silence, Laura turned to the maid and said, "Mr. Dalton might propose to me." The maid was certainly very surprised and asked if he had really confessed his feelings. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to make such guesses. But Laura could only guess from the words spoken earlier. The girl had also been behaving rather strangely lately, and it was precisely because of such thoughts. And when the maid asked the mistress if she was really going to reject his offer, Laura, with a heavy stone on her soul and heart, said that everything was exactly like that. The maid tried to convince her, but the girl's situation was not so simple. To refuse a man like Mr. Dalton, being a lady in her position, would have been extremely impolite. The girl had no such thing, and she was no longer young, but the maid did not understand this logic, because Mr. Dalgan knew perfectly well about all this and still had passionate feelings for her. But for her, marriage was something completely different, something impossible to produce together just because of fleeting feelings that suddenly arose and that were impossible to control. It was something more. Then the maid asked the mistress a very unexpected question. She asked, did the girl really not have true feelings for him, since she was ready to give it up so quickly? But Laura told the maid that there was no hidden love for him in her heart, so it would be wrong for her to accept this offer. After this, the maid no longer bothered her. She left the mistress alone so that she could rethink her thoughts. After this, Laura took the letter in her hands again. She saw neat handwriting, elegant style, and polite content, despite such cold treatment in an hour of anxiety. He gave her not only a letter, but also a wonderful gift made with his own hands. The girl realized that Mr. Dalton was truly a wonderful person, but remembering their conversation on the lake, she was very upset. Laura didn't understand when she allowed this to happen. She had a glimmer of confidence that if she never looked at him as a man, then he would begin to look at her as a woman. After all, she didn't look at all like the kind of girl who could play the role of his wife. Because of this, it was even more painful for her. She didn't want to set him up in this way, but in the end, she did it. The fact that he had now returned to the estate at this very moment was a great success for her. Undoubtedly, if they were to generate that feeling, it would soon fade away. She really hoped for this, and she was sure that when he returned, having put his thoughts in order, they would be able to restore friendly relations again. Thus, Laura simply lied to herself. She could not believe that this revelation could shake her soul so much that now she simply did not even know what to do. She had missed him all week. Her heart sank deeply at the news of his close, and she reread the part about his imminent return over and over again. When Laura thought about all this, she realized that it was not just a friendly affection. It was something more, something she could not even imagine. She had not experienced anything like this for many years. It was a forbidden desire that was not destined to come true, because from her sad experience, she knew very well that these feelings would not stop holding her for a very long time. She was upset. This time, for Laura, everything was even more serious because he desired her, and the girl could not believe that for some reason all this was not enough for her. Since childhood, the girl remembered the last conversation with her father. He promised that when the time came, he would visit her and take her to his place. He also gave her a small medallion in which was placed a photograph of her mother. This is all that the girl had left from her family and friends. Little Laura, who remained in the estate of Petaltones, only remembers this separation from her beloved father, which became the greatest grief for her. The grandmother surrounded the girl with love as best she could, as if she had once again found her deceased daughter, and the child's loneliness gradually dissolved in this care. But this only happened for a short time. The head of the family, and Laura's Uncle Gerald, received his niece in a completely different way. For him, she was nothing more than a wretched product of a scandal that had tarnished the honor of the entire family. The mother's will to leave the poor thing echoed with anger in his heart, and therefore daily quarrels occurred between them naturally, and they affected the Laura and her perceptions. The girl began to hide in the shadows like a little mouse in order to avoid her uncle, who, as soon as he saw her, became truly furious. He screamed, threw absolutely everything he could get his hands on at her, and sometimes even hit the girl, despite the fact that she was just a small and innocent child. After 3 years of worry, the grandmother, who fought tirelessly with her son, tried to protect her granddaughter, but in the end, she gave up raising Laura and decided to simply send her to a boarding school. The Utons were considered one of the most noble families in England, and upon entering college, rumors about Laura's origins immediately began to spread. Well, the girl didn't pay any attention to all this during her lonely hours. She simply immersed herself in her studies. Thanks to her natural intelligence and diligence, she became the very first in the entire class. And in front of others, she tried to behave like the stigma of illegitimacy. Laura was firmly entrenched in the girl, so she strove to become a smart, impeccable, kind girl, suppressing herself again and again. And while her granddaughter was staying at the boarding school, Countess Abigail filed a lawsuit against Jared in order to legitimize her family lineage. But confronting the head of the family, even before the eye of the law, turned out to be a very difficult matter. And only when she reluctantly agreed to a deal, bequeathing her entire fortune to her son after her death, did Laura finally receive the right to bear the family name. Moreover, when she turned 17 and finished her studies, Countess Epicali brought her not to the family estate, Ada Unhouse, which was located in London. She introduced Laura to high society. I hope that her granddaughter will love the social life that her daughter was deprived of. However, London completely remembered the old scandal, and of course did not accept the young miss. Laura lived in high society, constantly reminding herself that she could never be considered an aristocrat, for 12 years, and this could not help but hit her. The girl knew better than anyone what decisions based only on feelings lead to, and that is precisely why she treated the man that way. No matter how much they love each other, Laura's position in society will one day become an obstacle to this relationship, and this means that their children will be destined to know the torment that she endured. And since the girl did not want such a future, she decided to simply refuse Rudelton instead, because she also loved him quite a lot and did not want such a fate. Some time had passed since then, and he had already attended the farewell ceremony. Everything went quietly and calmly, and he returned to his estate. Since he had a few more things to take care of, he had to stay there for a while longer. But what bothered the man most was the fact that he could not be with the pastor in the last minutes. Because of this, he felt very sorry. In fact, John was quite a caring person. He even asked his servants how their health was and whether everything was okay with their families. That is why everyone loved him so much. The people around him thought he was cold-blooded, but the servants who worked with him didn't think so because they saw the truth and wished him only the best. When the man went up to the office, the first thing he did was rest for a while. But this did not last long, because despite the fact that not even 2 months had passed since his departure, he had a lot of things to do. First of all, he had to deal with the calculation of rent amounts, the resolution of lawsuits, and disputes between landowners and the reception of visitors, because these were truly urgent matters. After this, he needed to pay a visit to the mine where work had recently begun and meet with a lawyer. The most important thing was to resolve the issue with the estate manager. Because of this, the paper only made him more convinced that the situation was much worse than he thought. Now it became clear to him why his butler rushed to report what was happening immediately after he appeared at home. Not only did she turn out to be a slob, but she also took bribes, so the man should have immediately removed this manager from his position. And when several hours had passed since then, the man finally finished dealing with his affairs. How it flew by! For several days on end, he was immersed in the struggle with piles of papers, and only in such moments did he finally feel that he had truly returned home. Because he had been in London, he had not done anything like that for a long time, but had been caught up in a whirlwind of noise and vanity. And now only faint echoes remained of his memories. However, everything was forgotten except for the image of Laura, which periodically surfaced in his memories, because of which he had to wait some time to return to work. He was always interested in what Laura was doing. He liked to imagine how she might even have thought about him at some moments and waited for his return. He really hoped that Laura missed him as much as he missed her. It was truly unpleasant for him to realize that his feelings were most likely not mutual. She rejected him decisively, so she definitely didn't miss him. However, no matter how much he thought about it, he still considered this situation strange. Despite his kindness and tenderness, Miss Pedalton refused him without even hearing a single word of explanation or even an apology. She was worried about her devotee and the opinions of those around her, but John did not understand why she had to be distracted by such trifles. After all, this only made her unhappy. He had a sufficient fortune. A dowry was of no use to him, and as far as his reputation was concerned, things certainly couldn't get any worse, which means that none of these considerations can be taken into account. In the end, he also believed that he would come to the mansion and explain everything to her. She should listen to his position and only then draw her own conclusions. Having put out his cigarette, he believed that after she listened to him, she would certainly listen to his words. And after what has been said, when he again makes the proposal that failed him last time, Laura will shake her head. He is perfectly aware of this. Even in his thoughts and fantasies, the girl never agreed to this proposal, because she has a sensitive heart and will still remain true to her principles. Let him beg and convince her, or let anger take over. She won't even blink an eye. But even though the man was aware of everything, he was not going to give up. If he misses this chance and never experiences such a feeling again, he will blame himself for the rest of his life. So he wanted to fight to the last. And he was going to finish all his business as soon as possible and return to London. And after that, he would not return until he got an agreement from Laura. He didn't care. He believed that he had to bring her to his estate. Even if he crossed all the permitted lines, even if her gaze was filled with contempt, he would do everything possible. When several days had passed, his butler and assistant watched the man very closely. The guy noticed that the gentleman was behaving unusually and strangely. He pulled away. Her thoughts were constantly flying somewhere very far away, and her sleep was restless. Of course, there were no more problems with business. However, such a pedantic person as he never allowed himself to feel the confusion that, for some reason, incomprehensible to him, he now acquired. They didn't know for sure, but along with other servants, they began to believe that something had happened in London. And then one day, the butler saw a portrait of a lady on his desk, and everything immediately became clear to the man. He was even glad that the gentleman had finally begun to think about some lady. After the man finally finished doing all his chores, he had to go and visit his sister. Before leaving, he also warned his assistant that he would soon be leaving for London again for an unknown amount of time. Therefore, he asked him to find a new manager for the estate, and a good one. The butler was not at all against this. He unquestioningly fulfilled all his requests. However, he knew that, most likely, it was because of that lady from the portrait that he accidentally saw. Since his return, he has been rushing around as if he was stung, so he thought that their master had finally fallen in love with someone, and he was sure that he would soon bring them a mistress. When the man drove onto the grounds of his sister's estate, he immediately saw his nephews, who, as always, were arguing about something. The boys quickly pretended as if nothing had happened. However, John was incredibly strict with them because he saw that one of his nephews had a revolver in his hands. The children didn't want to give him the weapon at first, but in the end, they just had to do it. And the first thing he did after he returned to the estate to see his sister was put it on the table right in front of her. His sister was a young, beautiful girl who had long brown hair. Her name was Margaret, and when she saw this gun, she was very surprised and asked what it was. The man immediately explained the situation, and Margaret was glad that the two were finally caught, because one of her sons had borrowed a revolver from his father. Of course, Joanna didn't like his sister's irresponsibility towards the children at all. After all, they were playing with real weapons and could get hurt. But she didn't care at all about it. At that moment, the girl was simply sitting in the living room and laying out her magic cards, continuing to believe that they really showed her the future. On these cards, she saw that John had met someone in London, or rather that he was supposed to get married this year. Therefore, she asked him to immediately tell her who this woman was. The girl immediately started making guesses and thought that it could be Miss Paddleton. Of course, John didn't like this, so he got up and started to leave, saying that he had come in vain. And at that moment, Margaret suddenly began to cough sharply. The man, of course, was scared. He said that he would immediately call someone. However, seeing the smile on his sister's face, he realized that she was just playing the fool. Of course, he got angry with her. However, in the end, he sat down, and they continued the conversation. During the conversation, Margaret realized that his feelings were rejected because the man was not happy at all. She began to question him about this evenness, but the man, of course, did not say anything, so Margaret simply advised him to just remain a friend to this girl for the time being. He should not have forced his love on her, but become her faithful companion for life. She should have seen reliability and meekness in him, and of course, he should not have neglected the attention of other ladies. The man did not understand why he had to do all this. However, his sister explained that in this case, the girl would stop being afraid of him, and he would be able to get a little closer to her. When her heart melts, and she, without knowing it, is drawn to him again, the man should pretend that his heart is already given to another and ask for advice in love affairs. One's own feelings are recognized in jealousy, so the girl will begin to be tormented by envy, which she previously denied, and in the end, she will not be able to live because of the love board and will return to him. John didn't like all of this. He couldn't believe that she was actually suggesting that he play with the feelings of his beloved woman. In the end, he left, saying that he had visited her and made sure that she was alive and well. The girl couldn't keep him. However, when she heard about her beloved woman, she became very interested. So she decided to tell fortunes with cards. But they showed her that the man would certainly bring a new mistress to his estate. She herself was, in principle, sure of this. Meanwhile, at Baronet Lance's mansion, Mother and her daughter continued to discuss the prospects of establishing relations with Ion. After this, Madame Lance invited Jenny to tea with her, and it was she who reported the latest news about his departure to London. William reported this to her. The girl could not believe that the guy simply disappeared without saying a word. She believed that Miss Janet, Mr. Fairfax's sister, knew the possible reason. When Madame Lance heard all this news, she was shocked. But she believed that Mr. Dalton would soon be in London again because he could not just leave forever. Because they are not close enough. She could not send a letter to his home herself. So the girl did not even know what to do to contact him and find out when he would return. At that moment, William also came to them for tea, and the girl thought that this was simply an excellent opportunity for her. After all, it was to her advantage to get closer to him first, and only after that to get closer to his brother. So that's exactly what she was going to do. Mr. Fax is the only one who could keep in touch with Mr. Dalton, so she wanted to make friends with him in order to receive news and her beautiful Ion. After all, Mr. Fairfax himself was a very pleasant conversationalist whose company was relaxed, so this was even a big plus for her. At that very moment, Laura was mostly in her office. She had quite a lot of work to do since her grandmother's health was getting worse and worse, and she had to manage not only the housework but also her studies. She received several letters, a message from her grandmother and one for her from the priests. There was also an invitation to tea from Baron Lewis. The girl did not yet know whether she would go there, but when she opened the last letter and saw her uncle's name, she was incredibly shocked. For some time, Laura couldn't even open it. The girls were a little disgusted. There was no doubt that the letter had definitely been sent by her uncle. Moreover, it was addressed not to the grandmother, but specifically to Laura. The girl did not understand why a man who had never bothered his daughter-in-law with attention decided to address her right now. She eventually revealed the contents of the letter, which had begun without a proper greeting, was stated briefly and very directly, so Laurie quickly understood everything. It was like a mirror reflecting the character of the uncle himself. He was cold, devoid of a hint of politeness or warmth, but everything remained exactly as the girl remembered. Although she preferred it when they spoke only to the point, so she was glad that he quickly got to the point and did not scatter intrusive politeness. The letter boiled down to the fact that 6 months ago, Uncle his second son, named Charles, met in the United States with a certain Tom Price, a university friend of Uncle's. Through his efforts, Charus became engaged to Price's goddaughter, a New York heiress named John Danson. As reported in the letter, the gentleman himself had already arrived in London to attend the silver wedding of his younger sister. When the girl saw his name, it seemed incredibly familiar to her, and she assumed that it was a young man who had recently come into the world. Tom Price was an inconspicuous man with gray hair, but in reality, he was a Wall Street whale, skillfully moving American capital. And by virtue of his keen intelligence and charming simplicity, he was able to become the object of everyone's attention in the capital's aristocratic society. There were even rumors that he was originally from England, but moved to the United States in his youth, where he married a woman of exquisite striking and beauty. Their marriage was a happy one. The couple raised several children until death separated them. After the loss, Tom returned to his homeland after a very long absence. He explained his visit with a desire to attend his sister's wedding. However, the stranger's story about the loss of a loved one sparked the imagination of high society. No doubt, people believed that he was attending London receptions in search of a new wife. People began to spread terrible rumors about this man, and Laura even felt sincerely sorry for him. The appearance of Mr. Price became such a sensation that there is not a single soul in London who has not heard about this story, and they were all different. In the letter, her uncle asked for a warm welcome to Mr. Price, who had arrived in London before the others. And this was already very soon, because Gerald himself was supposed to arrive. Laura was incredibly upset when she heard this news. She understood that it would be a lot of stress for her, but she couldn't be upset, and there was no need to worry. She was no longer the frightened 7-year-old girl who was looking for refuge from her uncle's anger. Of course, Laura still had this unforgettable fear of her uncle. However, she believed that if she played her role with dignity, he would no longer dare to be angry as before, and everything would be fine. However, she was not sure that her precious grandmother would be able to maintain her composure. The doctor had already said in advance that the woman should not be allowed to experience severe stress, as this would further worsen her health. She was afraid that when her grandmother found out this news, she might become very indignant, or that she might suddenly develop an even more serious illness. Of course, she could not bear such risks.